Good morning, everyone. I'm Toni Coral Evans, and I am the Training and Special Projects Administrator at the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. They're going to pull up my screen, and we will go ahead and get started shortly. I'd like to let you know, though, that I like to think of this as a conversation. And so if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to drop them in the chat so that we can go ahead and get those answered for you. Just waiting for Leah to pull that up and we will get started. While we're waiting, I'm going to go over real quickly what the learning objectives for this presentation are. We want you to be able to define domestic violence and identify the common dynamics of domestic violence and intimate partner violence and the tactic used by abusive partners to maintain power and control. Highlight intersections of intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and demonstrate best practices when screening for intimate partner sexual violence and providing crisis intervention. Do you need me to pull up the presentation?
No, you don't see it on my screen because everybody else seems to see it.
Oh, I don't see it. All I see are the spotlights of the ASL interpreter and myself. Hold on, let me. Nope, even when I removed the spotlight, when I removed my spotlight, I don't see it all. I see are the ASL interpreters.
I'm going to stop sharing it and then reshare it and see if that works.
There we go. Now I've got it. Thank you. All right, so we can go ahead and go forward. So this is about me. You can read about it at your leisure. You're going to get a copy of this presentation. Just know that I've been doing this work for over 3 decades in one form or another, and really enjoy working on training. And I especially like doing this training because I did spend the first 28 years of this work in the anti-sexual violence field. So doing this crossover feels pretty good. Next slide, please. These are those learning objectives I mentioned earlier. And so that's what we want you to come away from today with, is understanding these things. Next slide. So we're going to start out with definitions, dynamics, and statistics. I'm going to try to give you a good baseline and grounding in this. And then we're going to go on from there to get into more of the ways in which you can deal with this. So next slide, please. So what is intimate partner violence? Intimate partner violence and domestic violence are often used interchangeably, but we use the term intimate partner violence because we find it to be more inclusive. Domestic violence for a long time had the connotation of people who lived together, were married, had children, and were of opposite sexes. With intimate partner violence, we remove a lot of the connotation of what domestic violence means. However, the government hasn't quite caught up with the field yet, so the government still refers to it as domestic violence, and this is the OVW current definition. Domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. Domestic violence can be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, psychological, or technological actions or threats of actions or other patterns of coercive behavior that influence another person within an intimate partner relationship. It's really important to understand that this definition changes every time the administration changes. So we have a really great definition right now of intimate partner violence that includes such things as technological violence and economic abuse, which are things that we all know are prevalent in intimate partner violence, but which are not always acknowledged. And so we really like this definition a lot, and we would like to keep the definition this way. It's important to understand, though, that with changes in administrations at the national level, this definition can change, and it can change drastically. So what does IPV look like? I'm going to play this clip, and although this is looking more at teens, young adults, and dating violence, it really is relevant to all ages. So Leah, if you'd go ahead, please. Thank you. I'm not getting sound.
I'm not either.
May just have not optimized when you had to reshare. So I'm looking in the chat to see who.
Can I hear it now?
No.
Nope.
Is anybody hearing it? Because I'm not. No, nobody else is hearing it. Oh, I see we've got some advocates from Turnaround, therapists. It looks like we've got, U.S. Attorney's Office. Good morning, Kelly.
I'm gonna pull it up on YouTube and then see if we could play it that way.
That's fine. And then I see that we also have several victim advocates from military bases. We've got Fort Meade represented, the U.S. Naval Academy, Sapper VA. Welcome. And then I also see that we have Joint Expedition Base Little Creek from Bob Beach. Hello, Caitlin. I actually live about an hour north of you. And Air Force also Fort Meade. Well, we have got a lot of military here today, which we can talk about specifically. Ooh, although Crystal might get.
And you're here.
I
just found out that one of my best friends was in an abusive relationship for so long, and none of us knew anything about it. I'm heartbroken. I thought we told each other everything. Maybe if I had spoken up, she would have talked to me about it sooner. So, here goes. Intimate partner violence, sometimes called teen dating violence or domestic violence, is a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner in an intimate relationship. An intimate partner is a person's boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, partner, or lover. Intimate partner violence may include different kinds of abuse. Physical abuse may include hitting, kicking, punching, or other kinds of physical violence. Emotional abuse may not include physical violence, but it can be equally as harmful. When someone is abused emotionally, they may be called names, humiliated, yelled at, or made to feel intimidated. The abuser may try to control the other person by telling them what to do, what to wear, or where they can and cannot go. Financial abuse is when a person tries to control and limit their partner's access to money so that the partner will be dependent on them. One example would be if the person discouraged or disallowed the partner to work and make their own money. Another is if the person takes the partner's money or credit cards and refuses to give them back. Another form of abuse is known as stalking and harassment. Stalking or harassing someone may include spying on them or following them around and constantly showing up where they are or refusing to leave when asked. Stalking also can include sending harassing or unwanted emails, texts, or posts. Finally, there is partner abuse that involves sexual abuse. This type of violence is when a person forces their partner to participate in sexual acts or behaviors without their consent or ignores the partner's sexual boundaries. Just because a person is in an intimate relationship with someone doesn't mean that they must have sex with them or do sexual things that they find uncomfortable or demeaning. If you or someone you know is being abused in a relationship, it's important to know that it's never the fault of the abused person, and it's important to ask for help. To get help, you can talk to the school counselor, a social worker, or another trusted adult. A great resource if you need information, support, or advice is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. You can check out their website at www.thehotline.org or call 1-800-799-7233. Remember, domestic violence is not love. Someone who really loves you wouldn't try to physically harm you, control you, make you feel bad about yourself, or force you to do something that you don't want to do. A loving and healthy relationship is about consent, respect, and honoring who you are as an individual.
Till next time, don't forget to visit me at amaze.org or go to my YouTube channel to watch more. Bye!
So even though the video focuses on younger people, those are all different types of violence that somebody can experience at any age. And it's important to understand that that doesn't always translate for everybody. A lot of people will not think about those different types of violence. They only think about physical violence. So if we go on to the next slide, we're going to be looking at the power and control wheels. And when you look at the power and control wheel, you'll notice that it's got 8 different spokes on it. It has using coercion and threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, denying, minimizing, and blaming, using children, using male privilege, and using economic abuse. And every one of these has different types of indicators, different things that are done. Some of them overlap. So when we talk about coercion and threats, we're talking about the types of things like, if you don't do X, I'm going to do Y, right? So if you don't do, if you don't do this, I'm going to hurt you, or I'm going to hurt your children, or I'm going to hurt your pet.
Hang on just a second, Tony. It looks like we can't see the PowerPoint slides. Not sure. It looks like a few other people are having the same problem.
All right.
Just Leah, are you able to pull up the slides? Okay.
All right. So yep, that's the right slide. So when we talk about using intimidation, that's the type of thing like breaking things, throwing things, maybe not directly at the person, but close enough to them, punching a wall next to the person. So it's saying, I could do this to you anytime I wanted. This is often when you will see pets actually being hurt or killed. So the use of intimidation is a really violent, even if it's not a physical violence perpetuated on the person, it is a very violent thing. And it's hard because sometimes we had for many, many years the same vision of what a domestic violence survivor looked like. It was somebody who looked a lot like me, blonde hair, blue eyes with a black eye, right? Like that was every poster you saw for 30 years on domestic violence victims. And now we understand that domestic violence and intimate partner violence are so much more, and that it affects everybody, regardless of race, and that it affects different people disproportionately, and that it also affects everybody regardless of gender. So men can also be victims, and it's important to understand that. Nonetheless, the intimidation and coercion and threats, they are violent. They may not be a black eye, but they are often threats of that type of thing. Using emotional abuse, that's that putting her down. That was on the video where you saw, he made like the when she went to have the pizza, right? It's telling somebody you're fat, you're lazy, you'll never be anything, nobody else will ever want you. You're so lucky you have me. If you didn't have me, you'd be out on the streets. Um, and so you say that often enough to somebody, and they begin to believe it, especially in conjunction with the next thing, which is using isolation. Isolation is one of the biggest tools in the abuser's toolkit. Get the victim away from any supportive unit, right? Get the victim away. Because once you pull them away from a supportive unit, whether that's physically by moving them to a locale where they don't know anybody, or moving them to an area that's very rural, or whether it is simply emotionally isolating them by telling them their family doesn't care about them, their friends don't care about them, their friends are always putting the abuser down. They obviously don't see how much you love the abuser. They don't really care about you. I'm the only one that can make you happy. And, not letting you go and see your friends, because every time you do, your friends are like, hey, this is not good to be around this person. And they know that they're going to say that. So they want to isolate you and make you feel like, even if you decided that things were bad and you wanted to leave, you'd have nowhere to go. So imagine being completely isolated and being told over and over again that you're useless, you're worthless, you're lazy. And I see in the chat we have a comment. We have had several male victims this past year, and it really made me realize we have her, she in all our forums. Yes, update your forms. And I have to say, this is the power and control wheel has only been validated on female victims with male perpetrators, which is why there is very gendered language in here. You will notice that I try to use much more inclusive language. And when we train on, for example, working with the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, we don't use the power and control wheel. We use a matrix that we created on DV tactics, power and control tactics. Because yes, we have to be more aware of pronouns and pronoun usage. Do you have options on your forms that meet the needs of everybody who might come in your door? And we'll get a little more into that later. But I want you to imagine now being somebody who is highly educated, right? Like you've got a college degree, you've got a good job working for the government, you meet a guy, you fall in love, you get pregnant, and he's like, listen, I'm going to take care of you. It's going to be really hard. I've been living, up near the Maryland border. You're all the way down here near DC. Come up and live with me. My parents are here. They'll be able to help take care of the baby, and then you can find a job up here. And they get married, and it's all, that's what it's going to be. And that is not what it is at all. Person is isolated in a trailer. This is before cell phones. There is no landline. The only time that she can make calls is when she's at the in-laws' house, and there's always somebody there listening in, right? Completely isolated her. And told her she was worthless, she was useless. Eventually, they wound up having 3 children together. And he told her, if you ever leave me, if you try to take the children, I will go into court and tell them so many things about you. Not only will they not give you custody, they will give you a hysterectomy to make sure you never have children again. And she believed him. It was only when she got out that she could really see how he had manipulated her. So that emotional abuse and isolation, especially in conjunction, is a very powerful tool and is very, very much a tactic. And you don't have to hit the person necessarily to make those tactics work. Denying, minimizing, and blaming. So when it comes to this is the, oh, I didn't really hit you. I mean, I just kind of like gave you a little slap. It was not a big deal. Or, I didn't, what are you talking about? I shoved you, you tripped. Or, well, if you'd had dinner ready when I got home, this wouldn't have happened. So either denying it happened overall, minimizing the, how bad it was, or blaming the victim for the actual thing that happened. Using children, if there are children in the relationship, using the children as a go-between, using the children to deliver messages, threatening to hurt the children, trying to convince the children that they're the parent that loves them and cares about them, and the survivor is doesn't care about them, doesn't love them. The survivor never spends any money on them because, of course, the abusive partner doesn't allow the survivor to have money. So all the presents are always from the abusive partner. So they can use children in just a vast number of ways. And this doesn't even stop when somebody leaves an abusive relationship. It actually tends to continue for even longer during custody exchanges and things like that. Using male privilege, playing the king of the castle, master of my home, what I say goes, I'm the man of the house, I make the decisions. And then finally, using economic abuse, which is one of the least talked about, but most prevalent. And when I say most prevalent, for people who reported, women who reported being in intimate partner violent relationships, 94 to 99% of them reported that economic abuse was part of the abuse that they suffered. 94 to 99%. And that abuse can take many different forms. It can be not allowing the person to work. It can be making the person work and be the only breadwinner, but taking all the money. It can be taking out credit cards and loans in the person's name without their permission, or forcing them to sign the applications and then running those up and ruining the person's credit while keeping their credit squeaky clean. As one person told me, they said, all the assets were in his name, all the debts were in mine. So that's a really difficult thing to deal with. So we've gone through all of these. Do you have any questions before we move on from this? I just want to see if there's any questions or comments. Okay, good. We will go on. And again, remember, feel free to drop that stuff in the chat. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the national prevalence of intimate partner violence. So as we know, domestic violence victims are found in all socioeconomic levels, varying experiences of education, every race, culture, gender, sexual orientation, physical and mental ability, and age group. On average, nearly 20 people per minute, 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. And just try to let the number sink in, right? So if we're talking that this is supposed to be a 90-minute webinar, right? That means that in the time that we are together, 1,800 people will have experienced physical violence. During 1 year, this equates to over 10 million women and men who become victims. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience severe intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner contact sexual violence, and/or intimate partner stalking, with impacts that include injury, fearfulness, post-traumatic stress disorder, use of victim services, contraction of sexually transmitted diseases, etc. On an average day, there are more than 20,000 phone calls placed to domestic violence hotlines nationwide. More than 20,000 phone calls nationwide. So, I mean, when you think about that number, it's really terrifying, right? Because those are just the people who are reaching out, right? Those are the people who are saying, that's it. I've had enough. I'm done. It's time for me to get help. And unfortunately, when we look at it and you think 10 million men and women a year are hurt or injured, you know, that's a really frightening thing. And this doesn't include, you know, past, because those are the 10 million that we know of, right? That's what, you know, that's kind of an idea of what we know. But 7 million phone calls, over 7 million phone calls a year to hotlines. And a lot of those are people calling for the second and third and fourth time. So it is a definite epidemic here in the United States. Next slide, please. So here's where we begin to look at the crossover in the national prevalence of sexual assault and intimate partner sexual violence. So when we look at survivors of rape, 46.7% of female and 44.9% of male survivors of rape were raped by an acquaintance. That means they were raped by somebody that they knew. Of these, 45.4% of female rape victims and 29% of male rape victims were raped by an intimate partner. So those are huge numbers. When the pandemic began, the numbers went significantly up. We knew this was going to happen. None of this was a surprise. You know, when they started talking about domestic violence being the shadow pandemic, nobody in the field was surprised by this. Like, we all knew this was going to happen. So we have to, you know, we keep thinking we're going to see the numbers start to go back down, because we thought, oh, here's what's going to happen. We're going to have, you know, we knew it was going to go up during the pandemic. And then we thought to ourselves, oh, it'll go up and then it'll go back down. It'll be fine. You know, it's not going to be fine, but it's going to come back down. But it didn't. So then we said, oh, well, it'll go up and it'll level off. It'll level off at some point. If it's not going to come back down, at least it'll level off. It's not leveling off. The numbers are continuing to go up. And I'm not sure if that is just that the amount of violence is going up, or that there was such a push during the pandemic and after for people to get help, that maybe people are finally reaching out who might not have beforehand. Next slide. So we have to identify that intersectionality exists. We can't talk about intimate partner violence without acknowledging the fact that oppression, until we can end oppression, you can't end intimate partner violence. And oppression's root is definitely in racial oppression. And when we look at the lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and other violence, you see that somewhere between 21 to 55% of Asian and Pacific Islanders, when you're looking at the numbers overall, experienced IPV and or sexual assault during their lifetime. So 21 to 55%. So 1 in 3 Latina women, 33%, significantly higher than when you think about the number I gave you earlier, which is 1 in 4 white women, which is 25%. 45.1% of Black women and 40.1% of Black men have experienced intimate partner physical violence, sexual violence, or other intimate partner violence. And 84% of Indigenous women experience violence in their lifetimes. 84%. So we know that those are huge numbers. And if you'll go to the next slide, you'll see that there's even more intersectionality. The numbers that are raising are percentage-based or gross, could be related to the population increase. So the numbers are percentage-based. So when we're looking at when we're looking at the numbers, are you talking about during the pandemic? I'm responding to Anna Laura in the chat. Now, could it be related to the population increase, the numbers? I don't think that population increase is affecting the numbers, because when you look at the percentages are going up as well. So it's not just the numbers, it's percentages. Yeah. That's a great question, though. Great question. When we talk about intersectionality, we also talk about sexual orientation disparities, lifetime prevalence of physical violence, rape, and stalking. Lesbian women and bisexual women both higher than straight women, and bisexual men higher than straight men. Notice that number for bisexual women at 61%. That is such a ridiculously high number compared to everything else. Bisexual women are at the highest danger for physical violence, rape, and stalking. And that number has been consistent over time, that it is always significantly higher than it is for every other category. I also do need to put a caveat on this. This study this is from a study conducted by the CDC in 2018. The findings are more limited because they haven't done as many studies on transgender folks. But transgender people, what they have found is similar, if not higher levels, compared to sexual minority men and women and cisgender people. Lifetime IPV among transgender people from studies range is from 31.1 to 50%. And we know those numbers are not fully reflective because we know the transgender population has not been studied as much. Why is it higher for bisexual women? I wish I could give you a solid answer to that, Vera. I really do, because as a bisexual woman myself, I would really like to know the answer. And there are a number of theories that have been floated. One theory is that that men think that bisexual women aren't really bisexual, they're really straight, and if they just show them the way, they'll be okay. And the other theory, especially with sexual violence and bisexual women, is that it's the thought that, well, you're bisexual, you'll sleep with anybody, you must want to sleep with me. None of which is true, of course. And it would be great if somebody would actually study that. But as a bisexual person, you know that you are like the last group of people getting studied, with the possible exception of transgender people. So yeah, more people are comfortable reporting. I think that stigma reducing led to more people reporting, but I think the numbers, again, have been consistent percentage-wise over time, that bisexual women have had this number over time much higher than lesbian women and straight women. And it's, again, I would love somebody at NIH to do a study and be like, this is what we're going to look at. We want to look at this and try to figure out why this is, because it really is a staggering number. When you look at where that is on this chart compared to all the other numbers, it's kind of like, that's really out of control there. So, and you see lesbian women are second highest, and they're higher than everybody else across the board as well. So lesbian women, bisexual women, who make up a significant portion of our population, are at really high danger. All right, let's go ahead and go on. Let's talk a little bit about Maryland. So I'm going to give you a 5-year trend. In Maryland, well, every year, the National Network to End Domestic Violence does what they call Count Day. If any of you work for domestic violence service providers or comprehensive programs here in Maryland, you know that they do this every year. And when they look at count day, they are looking like at a snapshot, a point in time on one particular day, what happened on that day at centers, every center across the country. And last year we had 100% reporting, and we're shooting for it again this year. So if any of you are with DDSPs, remind people that they've got to submit their count numbers. That's a public service announcement from my colleague, Angel Campbell, because she's the one responsible for collecting them. So 5 years ago, September 12th, 2019, there were 976 total contacts on count day. 702 people received services, direct services, and there were 265 additional hotline calls. There were 281 people served in shelter, and 421 people received supportive services. So that's a pretty good number for a day. I mean, don't you think? Let's go to the next slide. So 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 5 years. I know 24 seems like 5, but it's actually 6. 5 years later, September 6, 2023, 1,362 total contacts. 1,135 people receiving services, 227 additional hotline calls. 555 people served in shelter on that day, and 580 received supportive services. Those numbers are absolutely staggering when you look at the difference. If we go to the next slide, you're going to see exactly the comparison. Total contacts up by 39.6%. Received services up by 61.7%. Hotline calls were down a little bit, 14.3%. Served in shelter, a 97.5% increase over 2019, and 37.8% increase in receiving supportive services. Now, those of you who work for domestic violence service providers, how much more money have you gotten since 2019 to make all these services happen? And there was a little bit of a boost in what was called ARP money, right? The American Rescue Plan money. We got some of that for services, but that is all ending next year. There's something called the ARP cliff, that we are facing a moment. Yes, Crystal says our funding was actually cut this year by almost half because a lot of people spent their ARP money doing what they needed to do, which was hire staff to serve the people that were coming in the doors. Staff was turning over at the beginning of the pandemic at a rate that was so incredibly rapid, it was hard to imagine. And so salaries had to go up, recruitment time went up, additional staff had to be hired. I mean, you are literally serving double the amount of people in shelter. You can't do that with the same amount of people, right? You can't serve 37.8% more people with supportive services with the same amount of people. Only unfortunately, what we're seeing now is exactly what Crystal said. Services, funding for services is being cut, and these numbers are still going up. We just did count day 2024. I am going to be very curious. Of course, last year when I did this in training in September of 2023, I probably said, we just did count day 2023. I'm going to be very curious to see if the numbers went down. They didn't. They didn't. I want to believe that the numbers will go down for 2024, but I don't think they're going to. So we are asking our service providers to do more with less. We have to think about how do we get alternate sources of funding and things to be able to help them continue to do this very, very difficult work that you all are out there doing. Next slide, please. Total protective orders granted in fiscal year 2022. 32,733 were requested. 20,904 temporary orders were granted, and a little less than 10,000 final protective orders were granted. So realize that only of the orders requested, only 2/3 got temporary, and of the total orders requested, less than 1/3 actually wound up being final protective orders. But that's still a huge number. right? That is a huge, huge number. I don't have the statistics yet for 2023. They're a little behind in getting those out. So this is the most recent statistics that we had when I made up this PowerPoint. Next slide, please. So 2023 Maryland IPV-related fatalities. I am happy to announce that our number of fatalities that were IPV-related did go down last year. We are hoping that that trend continues, although it's not looking good given the way that 2024 has begun. So we do a memorial service each year, and during that memorial service, we honor those who lost their lives as victims of intimate partner violence, whether they were the primary victim or a bystander. And so, you know, each year we try to make sure that we do that and we put out this information. Next slide, please. So if you all want any of the information about homicides, this comes out every year. We are thinking about changing our format a little bit, but for right now, you can get this, a copy of this. It's a trifold that you can use to track things in your jurisdiction or see how things are in your jurisdiction. And we give a little bit of some things over time so that you can see if things have changed over time within your jurisdiction. Next slide. So here were the key statistics. 18 women and 1 man were killed by current or former partners. Women make up 94.7% of all the intimate partner deaths in Maryland. Black women are dying from IPV at nearly 5 times their proportion in the state population. So what do I mean by that? The state population of Black women is about 15%, and yet 75% of victims were Black women. 11 bystanders, including 3 children, lost their lives to intimate partner violence. At least 32 children were left behind due to IPV homicides. And 74% of all IPV homicides were committed with a gun. Not shocking news to anybody. We also very much need to say when it comes to the 2023 statistics that people who were related in a different way, we lost a judge who was litigating a divorce case to intimate partner violence this year. Because when he granted the woman, made the ruling in her favor in the divorce case, her husband went to his house and shot him. So, you know, we realize that anybody who is in this field is at danger if somebody considers you to be the person who, you know, caused their you know, victim to get help. Next slide, please. So here are the key takeaways from this section. Intimate partner violence is a pattern of behavior to control someone in a relationship through economic, emotional, physical, psychological, sexual, and/or technological means. IPV affects marginalized populations disproportionately, but anyone can be a victim. And service providers are continuously being asked to do more. So do we have any questions before we move on to the next section? Okay, everybody do a little stretch. How is, the data for the homicide information? We at the network collect that data. We work with DVFRTs, the domestic violence fatality review teams across every jurisdiction in the state. to get the data, to verify the data from them. It is a painstaking process that requires us to go through every article we can find on murders in Maryland to determine whether in our eyes they were domestic violence related, and then verify that with the local jurisdiction. It is a difficult process for the person who is primarily responsible for it. And we are constantly looking to find a better way to get that data. We're currently working with the coroner's office to see about being able to pull data from them. Their data is a little behind ours, so this is why we might wind up changing our release date of information, because we want to see if we can verify it through that as well. So great question, Sherry. All right, let's go on. We are going to talk about, this is where we get to the real nitty-gritty of the intersection of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that when we are defining intimate partner sexual violence, right? The overlap between intimate partner violence and sexual violence. It comes with 4 basic parts. It is any sexual contact or activity with an intimate partner that is making a person feel uncomfortable with the purpose of controlling through fear, threats, coercion, manipulation, or violence. So everybody can make a mistake, can read a sign wrong, and can perhaps try something sexually and somebody's like, ooh, God, no. And they're like, oh God, I'm sorry. That is not intimate partner sexual violence. It is when the person does not stop and when they are doing it with that purpose of using that as a control tactic. And so it's really important to make that distinguishing characteristic. So what might that look like when we're talking about intimate partner sexual violence? What kinds of things might constitute IPSV? Well, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that this is a wide range, and this is by no means inclusive, but it could include things like forced nudity, forcing the person to, walk around the house naked, not letting them wear clothes in the house, maybe not allowing them to wear underwear when they leave the house, things like that. Forcing them to view pornography, right? Sexual degradation, using degrading sexual practices against their will. Sexual regulation and monitoring. This is things like checking a person's body parts, using things like chastity belts, forcing somebody to have sex every single day, 3 times a day. Reproductive coercion is, forcing somebody to have sex or coercing somebody to have sex with the idea of getting them pregnant. Is one end, and saying, I'm wanting to get them pregnant, or if somebody is pregnant, trying to force them to either carry a baby to term against their will or force them to get an abortion against their will. Either one of those can be reproductive coercion, right? Because somebody should be able to make their own choice about their body. Unsafe sex practices, so not utilizing safer sex practices like condoms or dental dams or things like that, especially if somebody knows that they have a sexually transmitted infection. Unwanted sexual touching, pretty self-explanatory. And then of course, unwanted vaginal, oral, and/or anal intercourse. And that includes both with a body part or with an object. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the types of things that we have often heard from people who are in intimate relationships that they have been forced to do against their will. Okay, next slide. So when you think about it, let's talk about similarities and differences between sexual assault and intimate partner sexual violence. Let's talk about the similarities first, and you can feel free to either unmute or put it in the chat. What are some similarities between a sexual assault from somebody you don't know or an acquaintance that you're not having a relationship with, and somebody that you're, let's say, married to or in a long-term relationship with, or you've been dating? So what are some of the similarities that you see when we talk about sexual violence between these two different types? Both are not of consent, right? Consent is absent in both of them. Excellent. I hope, is it Jaslyn? I hope I got that pronunciation right. That's a beautiful name. What else? What else is similar in these? Oh, good. Thank you. I'm always worried. I'm like, I'm guessing. Both are sources of trauma. McKenna, again, I hope I got that right. Power disparity. Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. In both cases, it can cause trauma. It doesn't matter whether you knew the person or not, it can cause trauma. It doesn't matter whether you know the person or not, there is a power disparity. Yes, Sherry, these are absolutely similarities. What are some of the differences that you might see in somebody coming to you who is a survivor of intimate partner sexual violence as opposed to somebody who is a survivor of a stranger attack, or maybe an attack of somebody that they just kind of knew on the periphery? But when somebody's attacked by somebody that they either live with, they've been dating, they're married to, what might be different in that from other sexual assaults that you might see? Psychological impact. Yep. When you're talking about trauma, that repetition over time. Safety planning can be different. Yes, safety planning is very different with the survivor if they're still living with the perpetrator, right? Because the violence is not, it's not a one-time thing, right? It's ongoing. And then there's also, if they're experiencing intimate partner sexual violence, they're probably also experiencing everything else on the power and control wheel, right? So not only are you dealing with that really horrible sexual violence, but you're dealing with the fact that it's been minimized to them. They've been blamed for it. They're isolated and don't feel like they can reach out to if you ask them who are your family and friends that you can reach out to, and they're like, I don't have any. Because they've taken, the abusive partner has removed me from all of them. Because they don't realize that if they reached out to their friends would be there for them in a minute. Like they would just be there in a heartbeat, because their friends know what's going on in all likelihood. That's why the abusive partner pulled them away from them. So they think there's nobody there for them to reach out to. They're isolated. They're afraid to leave the relationship because they don't know where they're going to go. They don't have a place of their own, maybe, or the partner has said, I'll kill you if you leave. We know that leaving is the most dangerous time for a survivor. Shelters, one of the barriers we're really working to fix here in Maryland is shelters. A lot of shelters don't take pets. And a lot of people have pets, cats, dogs, birds, whatever. And sometimes those pets are the only thing that kept them going through the darkest days of the violence that they, experienced. They're not going to leave that pet behind. They will stay there with that pet. They will live in a tent out on the street with that pet before they leave that pet behind. McKenna says survivors of IPSD may have a harder time asserting their lack of consent in retrospect, may blame themselves saying they consented by fact of being in the relationship. Yes, understanding that consent is an ongoing thing is something that we are just really beginning to push with young people, that consent can be withdrawn at any time, that consent for one thing is not consent for another thing, right? So people who are in a relationship, and you're like, if you've been in a relationship and you've slept with the person before, they may feel like they don't really have a right to turn the person down now, but they absolutely do. All excellent answers. You got a group of real smarties here, I see, in this particular training class. Well, great. Let's go ahead and go on then. So this is why all of this is so important. Intimate partner sexual violence is an indicator. Prior intimate partner sexual violence increases the likelihood of intimate partner homicide by 544%. And 544% is a hard, like, how do you wrap your head around a percentage like that? Hence the picture. The big dog with the tongue sticking out is 544% larger than the little dog with the tongue sticking out. Also, dogs, because at this point in the training, you probably need a puppy or two to make you feel better. So, because it's, this is some heavy stuff here, right? This is heavy. So, but look at the difference, right? When you look at that dog, the first dog, big dog, I think that's a Bernese Mountain Dog, and then you have like a Puggle, 544% bigger. I think that makes it very physical and easy to see the difference. And that's the chance of homicide and how much it increases if you've been sexually assaulted by your partner. So that's a pretty big number. So here are our takeaways. Intimate partner sexual violence can take many forms, but the purpose is to control the victim. It's always about that control. And it's a strong indicator of the danger of lethality. All right, questions on that before we get into best practices. That's where we're going next. So any questions? This also gives me a chance to have a drink of water. All right, everybody still with me? Put a Y in the chat. You can put a Y in the chat so I know you're still here. I haven't put you to sleep. That would be great. Awesome. Oh, awesome. Thank you. That's good to know. I haven't put people to sleep. All right. Okay, so we're going to go on with best practices. So there is a study that came out, and when I say a new study, I mean this came out in 2024. So this is as brand new as it gets. And this was, it was talking about Counteract the Gaslighting, a thematic analysis of open-ended responses about what women survivors of intimate partner sexual violence need from service providers. So this is literally a study exactly on what we're talking about. What do women who have experienced this need from you? So the first thing they need is for you to not dismiss it. Apparently that was a major problem. Providers minimize disclosures when they assume sexual violence should involve physical force, that consent does not apply in a relationship. Thank you, Makina, for bringing that up. Or that sex is part of a woman's duty. Take a moment, let it, kind of have to think and try to remember we're in 2024 and people are still saying this type of thing. Normalizing intimate partner sexual violence led to continued and escalated violence for some women since their partner's behaviors were not considered dangerous. Women needed providers to take their disclosures seriously and genuinely listen to how their partner's behaviors affected them. So service providers were defined as those who were offering general psychosocial needs such as housing and financial services, health and counseling, general practitioners, nurses, psychologists, counselors, therapists, social workers, alcohol and drug workers, helplines, religious leaders, specialist IPV support and advocacy services, and law enforcement and legal response. So this was a wide group of service providers, right? And this is what they're saying. So It may not be necessarily the group of service provider that you belong to, but it's happening out there, and women that are showing up with you are going to be showing up with this in their heads. The second thing they said is they needed service providers to see the bigger picture. And that was that women understand psychological abuse to be an important part of intimate partner sexual violence. IPSV could be part of a pattern of psychological abuse, and psychological abuse could facilitate IPSV. Links between psychological abuse and IPSV led women to feeling violated without understanding or even being able to articulate why. Women wanted practitioners to recognize IPSV within broader patterns of control and help women identify the source of their distress. So, when you're going through all of these things, and maybe you've been told that, when you're married, it's your duty. And all of a sudden, rather than when you first had sex, you just had it and you didn't have any feelings about it, but now you are distressed because you know you're being forced, you know you're being coerced, you know that you really don't want it because of all the other things that are going on. It all gets tied together. And then finally, they said they really, truly wanted them to counteract the gaslighting. And so they wanted to address the silencing of intimate partner sexual violence. Women wanted providers to believe them and counteract the shame and disorientation they felt. Women also wanted service providers to help them identify it and seek support for it. Okay, so if they're the police and you're coming to the house, they want you to identify and seek support and help them seek support. If you're police officers, you're probably saying to yourself, well, how in the world do I identify if they've been sexually assaulted if I've been called for something else? Well, you do a lap, and a lap is going to tell you. And a lap tells you then, if somebody does, that you should go ahead and probably hook them up with, not probably, you should hook them up with victim services, right? Service providers needed to educate women about the context of intimate partner sexual violence as a form of violence and challenge cultural stereotypes that minimized and perpetuated IPSV. So when we think about it, we've talked a little bit about it already, but what are those cultural stereotypes that minimize sexual violence when you're in a relationship? What are those cultural stereotypes that minimize sexual violence when you're in a relationship? You can unmute or put it in the chat. We talked about some of these things when we were thinking about how IPSV was different from sexual violence that might be committed by a stranger or an acquaintance. What does culture tell us about relationships and sex? Sex is part of the relationship. Yep. It's part of the contract, especially if you're married, then it's really part of the contract. Religion may tell us that it's a duty, right? Obligations toward one spouse based on gender, absolutely. And yeah, no consent required, right? No consent is required. We're in a relationship, we're married, you agreed to something once, you agree to it forever, right? All of those things. Absolutely. And those cultural stereotypes have to be minimized. Ah, Crystal. Yes. TVs, movies, and such make a joke of women just giving men sex to get them to leave them alone. Absolutely. We do an entire training on the normalization of violence that Angel Campbell does. And it's amazing the movies we saw that we thought were so cute when we were younger, and now you look back and they're just cringeworthy. Oh, Kelly, to maintain for the family. Excellent. Yeah. So yeah, it's you know, you shouldn't do anything about this. It's really not that big a deal, and you don't want to break up the family, right? Your feelings don't matter. What matters is keeping the family together. Excellent. All right, let's go on. So here are some screening questions that you can ask if you are talking to somebody and they're, you know, you're trying to find out whether their sexual violence is a part of what they have been experiencing. And while these questions might be uncomfortable, it's really important because depending on these answers, you may be talking to somebody who needs medical treatment, that you may not know they need medical treatment if they haven't talked to you about this, right? So has your partner ever pressured you or forced you into doing something sexually you didn't want to do? Do you feel you can say no to sexual activity with your partner? I mean, that's a really interesting question to ask because it's going to make somebody think, because they may not even realize that the answer to that is no, I can't say no until you ask that question. Have you ever been intimate with your partner because you were afraid of them? That's a big one. Have you ever given in to a sexual encounter with your partner to avoid fighting or being hurt? You know, I was just at a training where somebody talked about the fact that there was a woman who managed her partner's violence, which included putting a gun to her head by having sex with him. And in her eyes, that was a perfectly acceptable way to maintain and manage her safety. So, you know, these are some really important questions. Next slide. Follow-up questions for detail when you're looking at details. How often does that occur? Is this something that occurred once, or is it something that is occurring over and over again? Are there patterns you notice? For example, it always happens on Tuesday nights when my partner comes home from playing poker with the boys. Okay. Okay, now we have some safety planning maybe we can do, right? Can you arrange not to be home on Tuesday nights when your partner comes home from playing, you know, maybe that's not possible, but maybe it is. This is a really good one to help them see where they're at. What would happen if you told them you did not want to do whatever? Because now you're going to find out what is the consequence. You know, are you comfortable telling me some of the things they force you to do? The reason this can be really important is that this can really lead you to understand where there might be some medical concerns. And what do you think would happen if you told them you were in pain? Again, this is a question that's going to get them reflecting back. So some of these questions are going to give you more information that you need for safety planning, for making medical recommendations, and some of them are things that are going to help them to maybe better understand where they're at in their relationship. All right, next slide, please. So the follow-up questions general, you all know these, you all say these all the time, I'm sure. How can I help you? If you're not sure what somebody means, clarify. When you say blank, what do you mean by that? Do not make the assumption that you know everything. Also very important when you are working with people where you may have a male victim or you may have somebody who's in a same-sex relationship, you may hear terms you are not familiar with. You may want to familiarize yourself with some of those terms before you hear them for the first time. But if you do hear something and you don't know what it is and you're not sure, you might need to ask, right? Can you tell me more about that, right? Is there something more that needs to be shared? And can we talk about who you might be able to confide in? Is there a safe person? Is there somebody that you can talk to or that you can go to, right? So remember, these questions could be something you're asking a person in person, but they're also questions you could be asking somebody who's called you on a hotline who hasn't even stepped foot in an office yet, right? And it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about the intersection of different people with different identities, to ask follow-up questions if you don't understand something, or if it's something that is relating specifically to who they are, right? And there may be terminology that you're not aware of. There may be people who are involved in the kink or the leather community that may use terminology that you're not aware of. And so it's important to learn those things. We have a very large 2S LGBTQIA plus community in Maryland. We have a very large kink community in Maryland. We have a very large leather community in Maryland. And they intersect in some places and not in others. So there's a lot of words that are used among different cultures that you may not understand. Next slide, please. So tips and guiding principles. This first one, these are the things that you as an advocate know. Acknowledge the difficulty of the situation, believe them, be prepared for any reaction. Understand that to them, you are part of a system, and the system may have failed them at some other point in their lives. Depending on how marginalized a group they come from, the system may have failed them their entire lives. So they may blame you, right? So be prepared for that, for any reaction from anger to incredible sadness, which brings us to consider trauma and realize that you could somebody in a trauma response at any point in time while you're talking to them. They could be triggered. They could go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. You need to be aware of that. And if you're talking to somebody and you've been having a normal conversation and suddenly they shut down on you, have they gone into freeze? What was the last thing you talked about? What might have triggered that? Same thing if you're having a conversation with somebody and suddenly they become aggressive, like really aggressive towards you. What was the last thing you said? What might have triggered that fight response? Keep the conversation open. Empathize and don't sympathize. If you've never seen the Brene Brown video on empathy versus sympathy, I highly recommend it. Sympathizing is kind of the, oh, I'm so sorry, here's a casserole. Empathizing is, I hear what you're saying, and that sounds like it really hurts. And I'm just going to sit here with you and listen. And take it slow, step by step. Understand that, these answers may not come out in rapid fire. And most important, and this is the hardest one, respect their choices, even if they are staying with the abuser. Victims, survivors are the experts in their own lives. They know that leaving is the most dangerous time. They know that. So they may realize this isn't a good time for me to leave. This is too dangerous a time for me to leave. My victim that I mentioned earlier, who was stuck and isolated in a trailer far away from everybody with no phone and 3 children, her friends tried to get her to leave and she was like, I can't, it's too dangerous. He'll take the kids. I'll never be able, I can't. She waited, and when he found a new girlfriend, that's when she left. And she warned the new girlfriend. And the new girlfriend didn't believe her, of course, until after, and he left her for somebody else. So it's hard to do that. It's really, really hard to do that, to respect their choices, even if they're staying with the abuser. But then you need to, so that you can safety plan properly. Next slide, please. So question for you. How many times, before we play this video, how many times does it take on average for somebody to leave an abusive situation? How many tries? Seeing lots of 7s and 8. So the average is 7 times in the United States for a white, cisgendered, heterosexual woman. If you are a minority, if you are a racial minority, if you are a sexual or gender minority, those numbers go up a lot. So this, though, I think you're going to see and hear some really how somebody has managed to use tactics. And so if you could take a moment as we look through this and look for, the tactics that were used, and be thinking about, why do people stay and how can you help when they do? And let's go ahead and play the video.
For a woman to leave an abusive partner, it takes an average of 7 attempts. For many victims, the only hope of leaving is women's refuge. Without you, that hope doesn't exist. Please donate at womensrefuge.org.nz.
So I really love this video because I think that in a little over, a minute and a half, it illustrates physically, without any speaking, what it's like, that feeling of being trapped, right? And you saw the tactics the partner was using, right? Let's go on to the next slide. So when we talk about why do people stay and how can you help when they do, think about some of the tactics the abusive partner was using. So why do you think people would stay in these relationships? Why would you, here's the, the $1 million question that, everybody asks, why didn't she just leave? And we know that that is an awful question because we know why people stay. Lack of support. Yep, Vera, absolutely. They think they are at fault. Yep, blame. They've blamed themselves. Nowhere to go. Where am I going to go? I've got 2 kids. I've got 2 cats. I have no job. Financial reasons, Sherry says. Yep, I hear financial a lot, especially in the rural area you live in, Crystal. Yes. Financial support is huge. Housing is huge. They want their kids to have both parents. Yes, Alexis, good point. They got into this relationship for a reason. They love the person at some point, in all likelihood, right? And they still try to see the good in that person. I think we all try to see the good in people. Low self-esteem. Yeah, sometimes it's what's been taken away from them. Their self-esteem has been taken away from them because they've been beat down so much. Antonio. Jaslyn, trauma bond. Yes. Oh, trauma bond. Yes. Extreme highs and lows, cycle of high and low. The pursuit to get the person back they had in the beginning, and the love bombing stage. Yes, love bombing. So person decides they're going to leave, and because something really bad has happened, they go to work and roses show up and a teddy bear and a box of chocolates and invitation for dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. And everybody at work thinks what? Oh, what a wonderful person your partner is. When you know that this is all because of what they did to you last night, right? Oh, they are promising to change or get help. The person might have a feeling of failure, of not being able to make the relationship work. It's my fault. If I just could blink, they would be less angry, right? That's that self-blame and shame, thinking maybe he could really change, right? And, I have known relationships where people have gone through programs and people have changed. The military, the Veterans Administration runs a program called Safe at Home. And it actually is making huge strides in abuse intervention. And we have abuse intervention programs across Maryland, but I've found that Safe at Home's model seems to work really well. And we know the problem exists very much in the military. So yeah, they might be stalked and physically assaulted after attempting to leave, or worse, Sherry. Yes, yeah, this time around. Yeah. So yeah. So what can you do to help? Here's the big thing. That whole thing about supporting them. Safe at Home. So Safe at Home is a model that the Veterans Administration uses with vets who have used violence at home. And so it focuses on the use of violence, and not on the person being a bad person, but on the use of violence being the bad thing. And it works with them to find different ways to deal with situations. So you're dealing with veterans, and a lot of times you're dealing with people who themselves have PTSD or other things that they're dealing with. And it really is amazing. I think our abuse intervention programs do things a little differently, but I think some of them can also do some really good work. It's just a matter of how it's facilitated, and really looking at, if you tell somebody you're a bad person, your chances of changing them are 0. If you tell somebody you did something that was bad, you can change the behavior, right? And the way that you help is you're supportive, and you tell them you can always come back, right? No matter what, you can always come back. I understand you're going back home. Let's safety plan, but no, you can always come back, right? You always can come back. Never shut the door on them. Next slide. So here are our key takeaways. The new study found service providers need to not dismiss IPSV, see the bigger picture, and counteract the gaslighting. Building rapport is extremely important when working with these survivors, and we need to respect survivors' decisions. And that is what I have for you today. If we go to the next thing, if there's questions, There is a evaluation form. You can go to the next slide. We also have an evaluation for you to fill out. I hate to double dip on you and make you do two, but I would really, really, really appreciate it if you would fill this out for me as well. I want to say thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you for participating. My name and email are in the chat. And so you can feel free to email me if you have any further questions. Thank you, Alyssa and Leah.
Thank you, Tony, for that wonderful presentation. I would like to direct everyone's attention to the chat where we posted our evaluation links. You'll see MCASA's evaluation link and MNADV's evaluation link. So again, we greatly appreciate all feedback. If you're seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for CEU credits, you must complete the MCASA evaluation form to get access to our certificate request form. I'll be sending out an email later today with a copy of today's recording, the PowerPoint slides, and a few other handouts from Tony, as well as both evaluation links. And if you have any questions, feel free to respond to that email. And thank you again for coming today. We hope to see you tomorrow.